Hello, good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar. It's COSHH, the misunderstood regulation. The regulation we're celebrating 50 years of the Health and Safety Work Act this year, but COSHH has been with us in its original format for the last 36 years. So something that I think hopefully most people will be familiar with. Tonight, delighted to have Rosie Russell and Jeff Mannion joining us. We're going to pick apart. I think we're looking at the substantive part of the regulations, the meat in the middle, if you like, of the sandwich, which is regulations 6 to 13. And Rosie and Jeff are going to talk us through their experience, and they may agree with points, they may disagree with points. I'm here just to sit in the background and facilitate in case the latter happens. But I'm now going to hand you over to Rosie and Jeff to do a brief introduction, and then we're gonna go to Regulation 6, suitable and sufficient risk assessment, with regards to COSHH that may or may not be misunderstood. Rosie.
So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Rosie Russell. I'm co-president of IIRSM. With regards to COSHH, though, I studied chemistry at university in 1991 to 1995 and did my first COSHH risk assessment as part of my undergraduate studies for my dissertation. So I've been involved in research laboratories, pharmaceutical laboratories ever since. So COSHH has very much been my bread and butter.
Thank you, Rosie.
Jeff?
Yes, good evening all. Yes, I'm Jeff Mannion. I work as an independent consultant. I sit on the London Region IIRSM committee. I was involved with COSHH 1988. A chap brought these documents, massive paperwork, to my office and said, "This is COSHH, you have to deal with it." I asked him what it was. He said, "I don't know, I'm retiring soon." And we then started down, and one of the first things we looked at was Tipp-Ex, and we were going, "Oh my goodness." But now I've moved on. Perhaps I'm still a bit scared, but perhaps I'm a bit scared about the results I'm seeing. Greg.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry, Rosie.
No, I was just going to say, well, we'll proceed straight into Regulation 6, which, like many of the other regulations, says that we've got to have a suitable and sufficient risk assessment before we start work. As you can imagine, the arena of chemicals can be quite complex. There's a lot of data to be considered. Fortunately for us, Regulation 6.2 sets out what we've got to consider. And so many times I have been asked by someone have you got a COSHH assessment for substance X? And my immediate response is, what are you doing with it? What concentration is it? How much have you got of it? If you take a look at 6.2, it sets out, it's more than 10 things that you've got to take into account. My personal favourite is 2.L, which says such additional information as the employer may need in order to complete the risk assessment. It's effectively saying that you've got to have a good technical understanding of the use of your chemical before you can actually start anything. So it is highly technical. So Jeff, I'll hand over to you.
Well, the thing is, what I'm seeing at this moment, I'm seeing COSHH assessments come through, and I sometimes have to review them for different reasons. And I'm seeing this likelihood by severity rating. You multiply one by another to give a value. And I'm constantly seeing these come up on COSHH. Now I'm seeing them by 6 by 6, so 36 numbers, without the person understanding what you've just said. They've just seen it as, oh my goodness, it's going to be a problem, or it's not a problem. And so my view is some of these assessments are, quite frankly, not worth it.
I would perfectly agree with you there, Jeff. I mean, Tipp-Ex actually is a really good example. Way back, people were complaining in offices, oh, they've banned Tipp-Ex. No, they haven't. With all of the regulations, you actually only need to write anything down if you have a significant finding.
Yes.
Now, back in 1995, your bottle of Tipp-Ex would have, albeit has an irritant sign on it, and it would have had a few milliliters of dichloromethane in there. Now, based on what we knew at the time, you would not have had a significant finding. You'd have said, get on with it. And indeed, that's exactly what I did at the time. On the other hand, Regulation 6 also says we've got to review our risk assessment periodically and take account of new information. With what we now know about the properties of dichloromethane, had Tipp-Ex not been reformulated to be aqueous, so water-based, it now would have been removed from offices.
I'm with you there, but what the thing was is at the time you'd sniff it, of course, just to see what it's like, because that's what people did. Pens, inks, this thing and that thing. We've now moved away from that, and I think that what we're perhaps focusing on here is health. It's about the control. It's not get rid of. I know there's the hierarchy of controls, but it's about control. And we do need some of these products, makeup of the products, to be able to work within the manufacturing of whatever we have to do, be that construction, production, or something else. We still need some of these things, but we're still not managing them in the right way. We aren't good with safety. Health is missing out.
And actually, the Regulation 6 assessment that you're going to do is going to identify, hopefully, those controls and actually identify what the health effects could be. But you mentioning controls brings us seamlessly into Regulation 7, which actually says that every employer shall ensure that the exposure of their employees to substance hazardous health is either prevented or, where this is not reasonably practicable, adequately controlled. And this then probably brings me to a shared bugbear. Oh, we'll give you some gloves.
Yeah.
It's the first reach for the PPE problem, which is at the bottom of the hierarchy of controls.
But before you go too far, gloves, yes, we recently had to go through a lab area, and I'm not a biological person. I understand some stuff, but I had to walk through a lab for some other reason. People wearing hand protection, using their mobile phones, scratching their faces, doing everything else. And these are protection things. But anyway, that's part one. I just want to clarify on something there. I have been seeing some of things recently, as I keep saying recently, where an organization, a large contractor, in their processes have mentioned COSHH, and they say about the COSHH assessment, but they've not considered isocyanates, they haven't considered man-made mineral fibers, they haven't considered dust. They've just ignored those because there isn't anything to deal with as far as they can see. And these are larger house builders.
And actually, you make a very good point there, because an awful lot of people, when they are coming to assess the use of chemicals, they forget that the product of whatever they're doing also needs to be assessed. So if you are grinding, cutting, or if you're undertaking a chemical reaction, the product of that itself becomes subject to assessment under this regulation. So you said about not considering mineral fibers. Well, they won't be captured necessarily under the control of asbestos at work regulations, but they will be captured under COSHH. So they need an assessment for the product of their work, even if it is a byproduct thereof.
Yeah, equally the same with when gases and vapors are produced and as a byproduct of what you're saying. These are not being thought of, and particularly where they're working in spaces that could be considered confined, but not necessarily under the regulations, but in a restricted area where there's a lack of air movement, and people are then being exposed to a higher level of things, even though they've been given hand protection. Sorry, I'll come back to your hand protection, but they're not given the right protective, like given, quite frankly, poor quality face masks, disposables, which are ineffective at some of these things in some of these areas.
So I think it's worth talking a little bit about the hierarchy of control. The first one is eliminate.
Yes.
The reality is for most processes, we're not going to be able to eliminate the opportunity for exposure. Perhaps if you've got a different method of doing something, if the substance that we're talking about is a product of the work that you're doing, by using a different method, you might be able to eliminate. But then we get to reduction and substitution. And what I often see there is inadvertent consequences. Oh, we'll use this instead, but actually it then introduces other hazards.
Yeah.
Then we get to enclosing things, so working perhaps in a glove box. That's often not practical. So we then get down to local exhaust ventilation, which is an absolute minefield. Oh, I'm doing a little bit of grinding of something, so we'll have this elephant's foot arrangement. The problem is the actual horizon of capture is often not properly assessed. People are not properly trained on using these.
Yes, and it's not near enough, in particularly when you go into a construction or production, those elephant trunk hose things are not near enough to the capture point as well. I have some experience of of someone who manufactures lights, and what we did is in a space we put made a sort of basic chamber, and we put the extract right above a dipping tank, so it was directly above, so it's taking the fume straight from there, and we put a lip round the edge to capture the extra, because it was oversized, so I'm using my arms and it's coming off screen, but we did that to capture. What we have done as well, we've set up some VOC monitoring to see what the values are, and we're constantly monitoring them at this moment in time, and we're getting values, and the values when off are high, when on are very low, and we're constantly nowadays tech and things like that are really useful for capturing that for the control measure.
And we'll come to monitoring in a minute, as it's one of the later regulations. But one of my problems with local exhaust ventilation is if you take a look at the HSE guidance on local exhaust ventilation, it quite specifically says that it must be designed for the task that you're doing. Yet, so often, suppliers are selling off-the-shelf solutions. Now, this is a fairly specific example from my days as a research chemist. I would do most of my work in a fume hood.
Right.
And it would come for the annual maintenance. And I would be asked to take everything out of it. So that they could check that the airflows were correct.
Yes.
And it's like,
yeah.
Actually, go back to the HSG document, and what it quite clearly says is that those controls that you have specified must be tested in under in-use conditions. And that is something that most employers seem to miss.
Yes. But also, if you can take something which is a complete throwaway for this, is if you've got your COSHH cabinet, you're all right, because you've got your cabinet, nice yellow thing with a hazard warning sign with all your bits and pieces inside. Perfect.
Back to the Health and Safety Work Act, have they been appropriately trained on the use of this? And the simple answer is often no. And I've been in laboratories where people go, yeah, I can definitely smell something. Your control measures are not working. So back to your risk assessment, which is, if you believe your control measures are not working, it's one of the reasons why you might go back and review a risk assessment.
Yeah, but what I do see is that often people are very good because they put a fire extinguisher nearby and a spill kit on the floor, just in case.
Because that'll solve everything.
Because it does solve it, particularly when you've got multiple chemicals and multiple solutions and multiple this and that. It's really wonderful. But I'm not sure that's a control measure. I think it's just oh my goodness, it's all gone wrong measure.
So Regulation 8, because we're stepping through these quite nicely. Every employer who provides any control measure, other thing, or facility in accordance with these regulations shall take all reasonable steps to ensure that it is properly used or applied as the case may be.
Yes-ish. Again, I'm going to quickly do one I did a few years ago. There was a manufacturing. They were made doors and wooden frames and cabinets and things. And they had a great big area where they were cutting, sawing, and doing all sorts of things, and particularly the spraying of different products. They were complaining because they didn't have the correct PPE. I was called in. What we did is put a wall with pictures of the measures. You use this when you're using that. You use this when you're using that. When you're using both these, you've got to go there. And it made life so simple because then it was visual, and particularly for some of the chaps who were doing the work whose first language wasn't English. Visibility was brilliant then.
I think that's a very good example of how to comply with Regulation 8. I want to step back briefly because I realised we didn't address gloves, because they are one of my biggest bugbears, especially being a chemist, is a lot of users of gloves do not understand the concept of a breakthrough time with
Before you go
gloves.
there, yes.
When you start using them, different chemicals will permeate the glove material at different speeds.
Yes.
The problem you've now got here is where people say reusable gloves. Well, if the glove has been exposed to that chemical, that permeation time clock is still ticking. So unless you have evidence that the substance is impervious to that particular substance, then you're probably having to change gloves far more regularly than you think you are actually doing. And indeed, some gloves are tested and they say, oh, 480 minutes or greater than 480 minutes protection. That's a working day. There's often no test data to say that the expensive gauntlets you are using today are okay to be used tomorrow.
I just mentioned because I've been through some labs recently where they were scratching phones, all sorts of things. That's not just the mobile phones; it's the landlines. If you can remember that far back. So so there was a lot of that, and you see them. But some locations, of course, you have multiple gloves, which becomes absolutely crazy. Because for me, I have to look on the back of the hand to know what gloves are. And then I don't always remember. On my phone, I've got a little app will show me. So how do people cope themselves?
I mean, certainly the default seems to be, oh, well, that glove seems to be okay for just about everything we do.
Yes.
Have you really honestly assessed it? And you go, oh, well, it's got the EN 375 mark on it that says it's good for chemicals. I'm good to go. You're not. Because if you take a look at what that mark actually means, at the lowest level of protection, the manufacturer may have only had to choose 4 chemicals out of a test panel, and it could have chosen the 4 least aggressive. So beware of cheap gloves. And even at the highest end, it's either 12 or 16, I can't remember, but that's the maximum number that's required to get your EN 375 stamp. Was it EN 374? I can't remember. But thank you. Good manufacturers will have published permeation data for many more compounds.
The thing is, though, and we go from a completely different way now, is PPE is a problem because if you go to some location, it is the uniform that you have to wear. Irrespective of what it is, you have to wear a high-vis, a hard hat and high protection, hand protection, boots. But in different places with your gloves, work out in different ways. If you've got some areas you may need to have boots which might need to be laced, etc. Hard hat has to be this. So we lose out on the PP, even though sorry, I'm going to just quickly go off. When you go to the exhibitions, which are on an XL, etc., what the big stands sell PPE when it's supposed to be the last resort. It's just sometimes this juxtaposition between the two.
And actually, well-designed containment measures such as bespoke LEV could save you a lot of money compared to the PPE over time.
Yeah.
So people look at the LEV and go, "Oh, that's awful expensive. We'll just use a mask."
Yeah.
Because you mentioned them earlier, and then forget that actually not all faces are the same shapes, and not all masks are the same shapes, and that you actually have to be appropriately tested and fitted and matched to that mask.
And reviewed on a regular basis, because if you have some dental work, etc., you need to do something.
And the mask has to be matched to the activity, because different masks will protect you from different things.
Indeed, going back to your vapor, etc., gases, vapors, and things of that nature, more dust, and you've got different combinations now.
So we're bouncing around a little bit, but I think this is maybe a good time for us to move on to maintenance, examination, and testing of control measures. Jeff.
Somewhere between 8 and 9.
So maintenance, maintenance is such a big thing from my point of view, because what you have is, if you take an air handling unit, you have to maintain it. You mean to open it up and inspect it and check it. There's a maintenance function. So you're getting some guy who's going into the back end of a piece of equipment to maintain it. Often they're not given any protection. They're not given anything. They don't even know what they're going into. And it leads into many things and potential exposures because they're not doing things. I know we're talking about maintenance of the control measures, but part of the air movement of a building may be considered a measure with workplace regulations of air movement. So it needs to be cleaned. Or it may be on the end of a LEV or something of that nature on a fume cupboard, which now you're into some real potential dodges, particularly in the stacks that have to be cleaned and maintained.
And that's where I was hoping you would go, because again, my professional experience is using things like fume hoods and microbiological safety cabinets, and that's going to bring us on to biologicals in a minute. But the annual maintenance or 6-monthly maintenance seems to be coming along and checking that the actual enclosure is good and that you're getting the right face velocity. So often they're not then actually taking a look at the ducts, taking a look at the fans. And I've got some wonderful pictures in my archive of a fan unit that had blown apart. Now, it was just about getting enough face velocity at the enclosure, but it was actually then venting everything into the attic space.
Okay, so Greg?
Sorry, no, I was just laughing at Rose's example. We had another one bizarrely. My professional career started slightly before you two. I was a microbiologist, worked in a lab, and not so many years before I started, mouth pipetting TB suspensions was something that was commonly done on a bench in the open lab. That's how it was done. Fortunately, when I got there, it was done in a separated area through a microbiological control cabinet. But in the first scenario, when they mouth pipetted TB on a bench, nobody in the lab ever got TB. I can think of 2 examples anecdotally I heard of where a small breaches in the cabinet when it was being done led to the person doing the work going down with TB. In both instances, it was lab technicians getting TB who were either working in the room on something else or actually were doing TB stuff at the time, bizarrely.
So under Regulation 9, it actually says that you have to do a thorough inspection and test. And that means the whole thing from end to end. And in the situation I was talking about, we actually landed up with rafters of a historic building that was soaked in peracetic acid. For those who don't realize that, the acetic acid is vinegar. Peracetic acid contains an extra oxygen that it can liberate. If you were to set light to that to those rafters, the peracetic acid would have acted as a source of oxygen. So we landed up with a major fire hazard and had to shut that building down temporarily.
But we also, I know the direction we're going, but if you go into a location that is cooking and it's got cook hoods, etc.,
Yeah.
the grease is building up in these stacks. They should be regularly inspected and cleaned and maintained because it's part of what we have to do under COSHH, and it's particularly relevant when you're doing these things. And if they're not, the buildup of grease can lead to fire, which is a real big problem.
And those are serious fires because you'll end up with a chimney effect that actually accelerates the fire. So you'll end up with a flamethrower effectively. But duct cleaning in your local exhaust ventilation is something that should be done regularly. At the very least, inspection hatches should be designed in so that you can actually open up and take a look and see whether it does need cleaning.
I've done a number of, oh, sorry.
Sorry, and badly designed ductwork can result in particulates collecting somewhere. So actually, part of the inspection of that ductwork may tell you how well it's performing.
Yeah, I've done a number in the past. I've done a number of inspections of ductworks within buildings, within the building services, and found there's all sorts of issues. Perhaps from original install where they were not installed properly. It might show some fire dampers on a drawing, and you get there's no fire dampers or there's no connection. And you go and open these up, and some of them are full of absolute rubbish that's been pulled in around the building and recirculating. And that's a problem because suddenly you're introducing another contaminants. The worst one I ever did was where the boiler room was leaking gases, which has been carbon monoxide in particular, and it was same makeup for the air ventilation for the building on one of the floors. Basically, they were, thanks for your face, they was just circulating, and we're picking up very high levels of carbon monoxide, which were the off gases from the boilers. Investigation showed there was a bad situation, bad install.
Yeah.
We've had a question just while we're in the vicinity of Regulation 9, and it's from Ray, who's asked, could you possibly explain the difference between loose fit and tight fitting masks with examples of each as an overview of the latest requirements for face fitting each type, please? Are you happy with that? Would you like me to repeat it?
No, absolutely got that. Jeff, do you want to go first?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure what the latest requirements are because the 2002 is when your face fit first came in, as far as I'm aware, under the COSHH regulations. So it's always been there. But the two different types of fast masks, as far as I'm concerned, is one which has a couple of straps, goes over them. That's a loose fitting. The ones which are more robust with canisters and things tend to be the tight fitting ones. I would suggest used in the asbestos industry because they're high filtration, high quality, and the levels of maintenance have to be better than the loose fitting ones, which tend to be look as a paper type thing, which you've been after a day or week. That's my view.
So the disposable masks, which I would regard as the loose fitting ones, they're actually only good for up to 2 hours of work, and they are still where'd
you get your 2 hours from?
Sorry, that's from it's from a guidance document.
No,
and sorry, I will come back to, but basically it's, from when you start working to, once you have your tea break. The problem is as soon as you break that seal, and we'll come back to the fit testing, you've exposed it to things that were on the outside of it. So it's no longer of any use. And in terms of face fitting those, traditionally there's been two methods of face fitting. There has been the bag over the head with something that you can taste, or there has been the quantitative method, which uses a very fine particulate, usually of something like sodium or potassium chloride. Far more sensitive, but far more difficult to do with the loose fitting masks. Not impossible though. But the problem that you've got with the loose fitting masks is they require much more in the way of training to get a good fit?
Yes. Just very quickly on that, what you have is the difference between the two is the first one, which is the loose fitting. People's faces change over a period of time. As you get older, your bits and pieces might have something happen. You might have some teeth work and it changes. So they do have a problem. The other thing is with the loose fitting ones, generally the people who use them are unclean. They've got unclean hands. They're taking the face mask. They put them upside down so everything goes into this area. So suddenly when they're putting it back on, they're exposing themselves to the contaminant that's trying to stop themselves breathing in. So yes, both require face fit testing. There's a quantitative or qualitative. Quantitative, pass or fail, bag over the head, simple stuff. The qualitative, which is numbers, and you put on a machine, and it's all done by electronics, and there's a pass through the face mask into the breathing zone as well to give values externally and internally to give that. And that's how that works. Hopefully that's okay for you, Mr. West.
What I would also say though is have a think about your men. If you have a fast growing beard, you will compromise the seal. At that point, a tight fitting or loose fitting face mask, a disposable or a half face, full face mask, is probably not suitable for the task. At this point, you are probably more looking at a powered respirator, which is a motor on a belt, blowing clean air up.
Yeah.
Or, sorry, go on.
Well, what there is I have a problem because I wear glasses like yourself, so it becomes impractical. There are a number of things around on the market nowadays which do not require face fit testing. It is a crash helmet thing. It will have the fan very similar to your explaining, and it's blowing air normally up through the top of the head and blowing down the face. So blowing things away from high filtration on the filter side. You don't have to worry about facial hair or anything like that. What you do, though, have to worry about is if you're using it and someone else has to use it, you've got to be very clean with in between. You need to make sure that it's wiped to kill out the sort of general bacteria they might be breathing out. Cross-contamination, that's what I'm getting at.
You've also got to be very aware of your protection factor. So a disposable face mask, at the very best, can give you a protection factor of up to about 40. So a 40-fold reduction of what you're breathing in.
Agreed.
Whereas these airflow helmets or the belt mounted ones, they can give you protection factors in the many hundreds. And in fact, I've seen results from some of these up in the thousands.
The thing is, though, they are good. I think they're really. I've been talking to a number of people who have them. The thing is, everyone says they're expensive, and I keep saying, well, yeah, if you want to hurt someone, you're going to make them ill. That's going to be bigger, and it's not necessarily now, next week, next month. It could be years to come.
Cost it up though against 4 disposable face masks a day. And actually the cost comes down quite a lot, but you've got to specify the filter carefully as well. And if you're using a chemical filter, they have a life, they have a runtime that is dependent not just on the amount of air you've pulled through it, but the amount of challenge you've given that filter. So if you're working in a particularly dirty, fumy environment, your filters might actually be your main cost. And then we're getting back into control measures and the fact that local exhaust ventilation may be a cheaper option.
But also getting back into the maintenance, because when you get into the filtration system and you need to change the filters, you've got to make sure that the person who's changing the filters on the end of the system is adequately protected at that time against the contaminants they're trying to be protected against. And
trained.
Yeah.
So shall we move on to monitoring exposure in the workplace? You alluded to it earlier.
Yes, well, this particular one at the moment we're running with VOCs. It's in a small manufacturing location in Surrey, and because of what they're doing, there is volatile organic compounds. Sorry for the people who don't understand, volatile organic compounds, which are giving the ache to potential people. So we're monitoring them. And that's how we're monitoring exposure in the workplace. It's given a value. It's not necessarily personal value because different people are doing different functions in the business, but it's given a value in the location. Now, the fume cupboards or the fume extracts are working pretty well because they're taking away the contaminants. We know we're getting a drop in rate of potential exposure. Is there much more that we need to do? At this moment in time, I don't think so. We're getting very good results. And we're making a comparison between on in service and off service. So we're showing a difference between the two in case the inspector calls.
Yeah. So I've got, again, a lot of experience about monitoring, both fixed place monitoring. So I in a previous role, we had an awful lot of human tissue stored in formaldehyde.
Oh, right, yeah.
So that has a very low workplace exposure limit. And to make sure the store was safe, we had continual monitoring there, and that was active air sampling. I've dealt with other things such as what I've got in my hand is a floor gas detector. This is for going into places where you might have sewer gas. So monitoring's great, but the question is, again, are you maintaining that properly? Have you specified it properly? Are you sampling in the right place? So I've seen sampling in the air duct from room extract. That's great. That's going to give you an average over the whole room. It's going to tell you absolutely nothing about the exposure of the operator. And that's where you might need an occupational hygienist to come in and actually do some on-person monitoring.
Yes. I've just been updating my skills into something which is BS 40102. I had to bring that up on the screen. It's internal air quality checking. And so they've put some things together for exactly that on the new standards. It's for hypothetically sick building syndrome and things like that to make sure that the environment is a nice, reasonable environment. Not so much in the field where you work, Rosie, but it's in the sort of general day-to-day occupation of people who go to a routine space. So there is some very useful information that's come up through that recently. And it's something that people might need to start to think about as a monitoring test.
And then the question is, what do you do with the information that you're getting from monitoring?
Yes.
So, for instance, in the situation of piped gases that perhaps we might use in a laboratory. So in some of the laboratories in my workplace, we have carbon dioxide piped in. It's required for some of our equipment, but we have monitoring in that room. Now, if that alarms, what are you going to do with that information? In our case, yes, of course, we evacuate, but it also shuts off the supply to that room, which means that if we've got a high carbon dioxide reading, you've shut off the supply, you've stopped it getting worse. You're actually one step removed from somebody doing anything such as evacuating. So you've got to have appropriate arrangements for emergencies, which is one of the later regulations.
Of course, but this in the location where you're carrying out your occupation, I have to assume that all your pipes and services are labelled with the appropriate product, substance. Whereas many times you go, I was just looking at a building this week for I won't give the reason why. I was looking for this building and I couldn't fathom out where these pipes went or what they did. I just couldn't work it out. We need things such as labelling, because that can help with COSHH. It can help with understanding what you have travelling through. And it can help out when there is an emergency, say, well, that was what happened. Otherwise, if it goes wrong, an emergency crews come in, they're just going to deal with what they have to deal with.
So shall we move on to 11, which is health surveillance?
Yes.
I have heard so many times, oh, well, either we don't need to do health surveillance or we shall do health surveillance. Well, health surveillance is, again, this is another output from your risk assessment.
Yeah.
And the problem for me with health surveillance is the same problem as with monitoring exposures in the workplace, is by the time you detect a problem, you've already exposed people.
Yes.
The other thing is, oh, we'll just send them for medical ones here. That's great. What are you checking for?
Yeah.
If you take a look at the control of lead regulations, lead being a specific case that has its own set, but really, you know, we can treat this as a hazardous substance under COSHH. There is a urine test.
Yes.
You know, we can actually detect exposures at a level below which would actually cause harm, which means your health surveillance can feed into your control measures. But if it's substance X and there is no test for it, and we don't know what disease it causes, why are you spending money on health surveillance?
Yeah.
Because it's not going to tell you anything.
Also, with my experience with the health surveillance is, oh, we don't want to do it. Send them to the GP. Sending somebody to the GP with an issue isn't effective enough either. Most GPs are what are general practitioners. They don't understand this. They may see a rash on the back of the hand and say, oh, it's a bit of eczema. It may be or may not be related to the procedure, but they wouldn't understand. And we need to pass on that information from your assessment to say, we might need to do this. And there's plenty of information available nowadays to see what health effects you can get from exposure.
You wouldn't go and see an osteopathic surgeon for an ear, nose, and throat problem.
Indeed.
It's that simple. General practitioners are just that, and occupational medicine is a discipline of
Indeed.
itself. And in actual fact, a good occupational physician can give you an awful lot of advice around your control measures and your risk assessments.
Yes. They also can. I did some work many years ago where I worked with a number of nursing type occupational health people who were doing things, and mine was more safety related. And I was talking to a Dr. Chan then, and he was talking about removing gloves at that time.
Mm.
And I know I still see it's crazy well, but health surveillance down to the bare looking at things like that, the hands, these are the working tools of what we do, and we need to protect them as much as we can.
However, whether you're doing health surveillance or not, you have to keep a record of exposures that your employees have. And, you know, forget GDPR here or, you know, keeping things for, you know, 6 years or something like that. COSHH says you've got to keep it for 40 years beyond the last exposure. And that's because of long latency diseases that we don't know about today. Asbestos would be a really good example that it took us a long while to realize that that was a problem. So your record keeping about who was working with what.
Agreed. And when you get into this health surveillance, working with things like pesticides and insecticides and things of that nature, which are quite common to buy across the counter for an ordinary individual. But there are specialist organizations who come along and use these things to deal with the workplace and have to put these things around. And often they're not thinking about what the problems are from the exposure to them, but necessarily the exposure to others while they're putting this product in place to deal with the problem they have.
And actually those secondary exposures are something that we don't think a lot about. There certainly were cases where the wife of someone who was working with asbestos landed up with asbestosis because they were laundering their husband's overalls afterwards. It's one of the things that I say to people in the laboratory who, for whatever reason, decide they're not going to wear their lab coat today. It's like, you've got kids. They come up and hug you when you go home. Where do they put their face? Right where your clothes could have been exposed to chemicals.
Yeah.
They usually wear their lab coat after that.
Yes.
Shall we move on to information, instruction, training and supervision?
And at that
Because
point,
that's-
Rosie, perhaps a good intervention here. We've had a question in from Justin, who's asked, training, what is good training for COSHH? And then qualified by saying, the HSE focuses on employees knowing the outcomes of the assessment. Is this enough?
No. Sorry, but no. Again, I'm coming from a laboratory and pharmaceutical background here, and the assessment is one thing, and you actually don't need to hand somebody an assessment to read because they can be quite technical. You need to have a safe system of work that can be followed, but people have to understand and be able to comprehend the hazards that they're working with, and that does mean training people and providing appropriate information on the health effects of the chemicals that they're working with, because that helps them understand why they're doing it a certain way. They've got to be trained on how to use the material. An example from my discipline would be disinfecting a laboratory bench. It's very tempting if you've got a spray bottle of disinfectant to spray it everywhere and then wipe down. The problem is you've just aerosolized a huge amount of that material. What you're actually meant to do is spray it onto a cloth and then wipe. Even better, get impregnated cloths and you've reduced exposure again. So you've got to train people on the correct method of use and why that is important. Otherwise, they'll do it their own way. And then work as envisaged differs from work as done. And your risk assessment's worth nothing.
You also, with the training, I believe that you really need to explain to people what happens when things go wrong, what happens if things go wrong, and what the measures are at that time, such as the emergency procedures. I'm talking spill kits and things of that nature. And I've seen places where they've got multiple spill kits, which are functionable, but then over a period of time, the bags and things they come in part, they just fall apart and it becomes unusable. And when they need them, it's too late.
And you're moving beautifully into Regulation 13, arrangements to deal with accidents, incidents, and emergencies.
I was going to say, perfect segue.
And I've dealt with some chemicals that are highly toxic. And you actually have to have specialist life support available for people working with those. So working with cyanides, for instance, you have to have first aiders that are trained on the administration of oxygen. But they've also got to be trained on handling cyanides, etc.
Yeah.
So this gets very complicated very quickly if you let it. But maintenance of your arrangements, which is what you're talking about with spill kits, training of people as to how they deal with a chemical spill.
Yes, and particularly wearing the appropriate equipment for when there's a spill. It's no use suddenly going picking up this product with your bare hands if you're using specialist hand protection in the first place. But one of the things is I've found in the past, for simple measures, sand or cat litter, these things are really very useful products, very cheap and available.
Excellent, certainly for household chemicals or things of similar hazard. If you spilt some bleach at home and you've got cat litter at hand, that would be an excellent way of not just immobilizing the spill, but absorbing it so that you can then just sweep it up, and then you've got a small amount of something that you might need to mop.
Absolutely.
A mistake that people often make is they don't think about their route in to deal with the spill. They don't think about the energy involved in the spill, so spattering and what else it might have covered. They don't think about working from the outside in, so that you're always containing and reducing the area of a spill. So there's a lot of training that's required there, but now I'm talking about probably fairly inconsequential liquids. How about gas?
and there's not a lot you can do sometimes. You need something in place perhaps to alert you that there is a gas problem. You might need monitoring in the location, but then if it may need evacuation. And in some locations, particularly where you may be involved, that's not always an easy thing to do because of the space between.
Indeed, indeed.
I want to quickly say something. All these things, people get too caught up in this, and I'm seeing mass bureaucracy nowadays in health and safety, mass bureaucracy on COSHH assessments. I don't know if you know what plumber's mate is, but plumber's mate is a waterproof putty used in the plumbing trades. I've seen COSHH assessments, a couple of pages long, telling you how to use it. Seen things like that. And it's just crazy. The other one is I've seen where you get lists and lists of all information on the domestic type products that you have at home, you'd have in the workplace, the dishwashing materials, the dishwashing, I'm not allowed to say the liquid detergent things and things like that. But COSHH assessments written out with copious amounts of information. We don't need to go that far on the everyday product.
No, we don't. And in fact, actually, the hazard classification of the substance, if you've got 4 cleaning products and they all say that they're corrosive, well, it's actually probably 1 risk assessment.
Yeah.
So you can actually make your life so much easier. One organization that I worked with had thousands of risk assessments. By the time I left, they had just over 250.
Yeah, that's where it should be.
Exactly. Now, we didn't really talk about biologicals.
No,
Now,
that's your area.
but it should be everybody's area. So you have someone who is cleaning toilets is
Indeed.
dealing with a biological risk.
Absolutely.
Somebody who is clearing up pigeon excrement is dealing with a biological risk, and these come under COSHH. And we don't often think about that. And there is actually some really very good guidance in the approved code of practice about environmental biological substances. One that comes under COSHH, and we often don't think about it because it has its own approved code of practice, is Legionella. And if you've got someone who is sampling water pipes for Legionella, you do need an assessment of that activity. But, and here's my big bugbear, you don't need just an assessment of the Legionella risk. You can wrap it into another risk assessment. Nowhere in any of the regulations does it say that you must risk assess each regulation independently. Because remember something I said right at the beginning, you are assessing the activity.
Indeed. I must admit, I'm with you. The Legionella one, I deal with Legionella risk quite frequently. One of the things is I've got this thing about MRSA. I wondered, and this is an opinion, that over the last few years, because the people have been scared of this COSHH, they've reduced the sort of kill power of the disinfectants in the hospital environments. Therefore, there's a problem. When I was younger, a couple of years ago, in the hospital, there was a hospital smell. You could smell the hospital. Nowadays, that isn't there. I'm not saying it's an unclean smell, but they're not using perhaps the same strength of product in the cleaning process.
I think, to be honest, actually, the problem is they're not cleaning as much as they did.
I can agree with that as well.
So, sorry, go on, Greg.
Sorry, I was just going to say the MRSA methicillin-resistant Staph aureus as well is long-term injudicious use of antibiotics is the other thing that we're selecting for.
So I think, unless, Jeff, you've got anything particular to add, because we are coming up on time here, I think we've kind of picked apart the main regulations we wanted. But what I would say is, don't be afraid of this. L5, the approved code of practice for the control of substances hazardous to health regulations, is actually really helpful. the information you need is out there.
Yes. But sometimes you need to take advice. I'm with you there. I'm not saying it from my point of view. I'm saying sometimes you need to ask someone. And these types of forums that we have here through IIRSM are useful tools for people to ask the question.
Very much so. And I would say that COSHH is probably one of the top areas where you do need access to a competent person.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of organizations make the mistake of saying, oh, well, we'll hire an ex-consultant, they'll be our competent person. Competent person on what?
Indeed.
Because I would not regard myself as a competent person on every single piece of legislation. Oh, well, perhaps I am because I know my limitations and I can hire somebody else in, but you may need multiple people to help you out. But if someone's saying you need lots and lots of paper to manage this risk, sorry, no.
And unfortunately, the health and safety consultants world is full of similar things where lots of people seem to know everything. And oh my, we won't get into that debate today.
That's probably another webinar topic, Jeff. You've lined stuff for later in the year.
Do we have any more questions, Greg?
I have none on either the chat or the Q&A, but just while I'm going to make my thank you, Siobhan, I'm going to get you to work a little bit harder. Just one takeaway tip for the audience from you both, in terms of what they should be doing with COSHH. I know you've already highlighted, Rosie, that don't be scared of it. It is that there is support there. Recognise what you can do and get help in for those elements you can't. But one takeaway message while we wait for any more questions, if there are any.
If you're automatically defaulting to personal protective equipment, you've probably not done a thorough enough risk assessment, and it will not stand up to scrutiny should the inspector come calling. You have to justify if that's where you land up.
Agreed. What I think we need to do is, if you have a product and there's a data sheet, data sheets have useful information. It may not be the be all and end all because that gives you some hazardous information, but it doesn't tell you about how you work with it. So it's a starting point to give you the leverage to move that assessment forward.
Brilliant, Jeff. Thank you very much indeed. We don't have any more questions. It's coming up to this by my clock. It's 7:01, so I think we'll start to wind down. Just one point I was contemplating with regards to the TIPEX was not technology the death knell for TIPEX?
Yes.
In terms of we no longer need it. So I suppose replacement there might be a. But on that note, Rosie, Jeff, thank you very much indeed for your time, and a very informed and very informational webinar and debate there around the topic of COSHH, which is something that I think affects everybody, whether you're managing a building or managing a process or managing people. COSHH is in there somewhere. Hopefully everybody's got something to take away. So on behalf of the London branch, thank you very much indeed for your time, and I hope everybody has a lovely evening. Thanks all.
Thank you.